Today's Washing Tech episode is brought to you by Audible. Get a free audiobook download and 30-day free trial at washingtech.com/book. Over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or MP3 player. And also Warby Parker. Get a free 5-day home try-on at warbyparkertrial.com/Joe. 5 pairs, 5 days, and the try-on is 100% free. That's warbyparkertrial.com/Joe.
I think really the smart city is coming from a particular ideology, one that very much prioritizes technology as the answer to all problems.
Welcome to the Washing Tech Policy Podcast. We deliver the latest tech policy news and brightest tech policy experts to you, wherever you are, so you can stay productive, relevant, and informed in less time. From Washington, D.C., it's the Washing Tech Policy Podcast with Joe Miller.
It was a rough week for Google on LGBTQ issues. Facebook bans white nationalism and separatism. And Ben Green is my guest today. It was a rough week for Google and the LGBTQ community. First, the Human Rights Coalition suspended Google from its rankings, for which Google had a perfect rating, because Google allowed an app promoting conversion therapy to remain in its app store. Google has since pulled the app. Also, several Googlers took aim at Google's new Advanced Technology External Advisory Council last week for naming Heritage Foundation President Kay Cole James as a member. James has repeatedly spoken out frequently against LGBTQ interests and trans folks in particular. So over 1,000 Googlers signed on to a letter published on Medium opposing Cole's appointment. NAACP President Derek Johnson also criticized Google for failing to include civil rights leaders on the council. Facebook announced that it will now ban content promoting white nationalism and white separatism. The company will ban content with phrases that explicitly refer to white nationalism and white separatism, but Facebook said that finding implicit instances of white nationalism and white separatism will take some time for Facebook to learn how to identify. Mark Zuckerberg also wrote a Washington Post op-ed seeking a third-party tribunal that would reinforce Facebook's efforts. But Republican FCC Commissioner Brendan Carr weighed in on Twitter opposing such a framework. The Department of Housing and Urban Development, which has already sued Facebook for allowing real estate advertisers to exclude certain ethnicities and zip codes, is now investigating Twitter and Google as well, according to the Washington Post. A group of IBM ex-employees sued the company in federal court in New York City for failing to disclose how many people it laid off who are over the age of 40. It's the second lawsuit following a ProPublica report last year that documented rampant alleged age discrimination at the company. At issue is a provision in IBM's separation agreement that requires employees to agree not to sue the company in exchange for severance pay. Google and Cuba's state-run telecommunications monopoly, Atexa, have agreed to begin negotiations on bringing better connectivity to the island. The agreement entails Google's and Atexa's engineers working together to bring better connectivity to the island via Google's points of presence in Florida, Mexico, and Colombia without having to pay the hefty interconnection fees it's been paying to a third-party carrier to connect to Venezuela. Finally, Nipsey Hussle, the rapper and community champion who was murdered in front of his clothing shop in L.A. on Sunday, was an avid supporter of science, technology, engineering, and math education for underrepresented youth and diversity in tech. John Ketchum writes for Afrotech that in an LA Times interview last year, Hussle was quoted as saying that kids are often nudged to emulate athletes and entertainers, but that there should be more messaging around emulating tech leaders like Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg. Events. We've got the International Privacy and Security Forum starting tomorrow, April 3rd, running through the 5th in Washington, D.C., and that's going to be at the Marvin Center, which is located at 800 21st Street Northwest in Washington, D.C. We've also got the CHCI Graduate Fellows program, which is ending today on Capitol Hill. It's a policy briefing series, and that's going to be in Rayburn, room 2043. And then we also have a Women Talk Tech and Policy event hosted by The Bridge and We Work and Women in Tech, and that's going to be at 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. on Wednesday, tomorrow, April 3rd, and that's going to be at WeWork at 1440 G Street Northwest. And you can find links to the events and the stories in our show notes or on our Twitter page, and our handle is at Washington. Stay with us. For Washington Tech Policy Podcast listeners, Audible is offering a free audiobook download with a free 30-day trial to give you the opportunity to check out their service. You can listen at the gym, in the car, or on your morning run. How about An Indigenous Peoples History of the United States by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz?
The peoples of the Caribbean, Central America, Mexico, and the Andes were the first overseas victims. West and South Africa, North America, and the rest of South America followed. Then came all of Africa, the Pacific, and Asia.
You can download An Indigenous Peoples History of the United States free by trying audible.com. Sign up for your free audiobook and 30-day trial today at washingtech.com/book.
Washington, the inclusive voice of tech policy. Because America won't stand still for the same old insiders. Insiders. Washington, moving the needle.
My guest today is Ben Green, PhD candidate in applied math at the Harvard School of Engineering and Applied Sciences and an affiliate of the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard. He studies the implementation and impacts of data science in local governments with a focus on smart cities and the criminal justice system. Analyzing the intersections of data science with law, policy, and social science, Ben focuses on the social justice and policy implications of data-driven algorithms deployed by governments. His forthcoming book, The Smart Enough City, Putting Technology in Its Place to Reclaim Our Urban Future, will be published in April 2019 on April 9th with MIT Press. Ben completed his undergraduate degree in mathematics and physics at Yale. His graduate work has been funded by the NSF Graduate Research Fellowship and the Herbert Winokur SEAS Graduate Fellowship. Please welcome Ben Green. Ben, thanks for joining me.
Thanks so much for having me on, Joe.
So we've heard a lot about smart cities, and we've heard a lot about bias and algorithms, and these have been sort of two separate conversations, but you're saying that these two conversations should merge. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely, because increasingly algorithms and data are being used in smart cities. That's often sort of what the smart city is all about. And so we need to be focusing on these issues in the context of cities.
And we've heard the term a lot, but what exactly is a smart city?
So the idea behind a smart city is really all about using technology, implementing and integrating technology into cities. I really like a definition from Cisco. They tend to talk about a smart city being one that combines infrastructure with technology. And like it in the sense of it provides a good description of what the smart city is about. So this can include sensors on street poles, self-driving cars, algorithms that predict where crime and other behavior and phenomenon are going to occur, or apps that allow people to connect with one another or with their city government.
And you point to some disparities in your book. Do you see these disparities as something that's unintentional, or do you see it as more deliberate or as an ideology?
I think really the smart city is coming from a particular ideology, one that very much prioritizes technology as the answer to all problems. And I think, one thing that we can talk about is the ways in which, the different types of technologies that I was talking about in, just a moment ago, often do not actually solve the types of problems that they're being implemented to solve. There's a lot of hype around what these technologies can do that often far outweighs what they're capable of and isn't often very well grounded in the issues that are actually trying to be addressed. And so oftentimes these technologies will create new types of problems or exacerbate existing problems. I think about the smart city as resulting from an ideology that I call tech goggles. This is sort of a perspective on the world that engineers have where everything is a technology problem. We only recognize and try to solve the problems where there's a technological solution. And these tech goggles really are motivated by this idea that technology is what actually leads to social change and social progress, and that technology is neutral and provides optimal solutions. So, to the point about bias and discrimination and algorithms, we really need to be recognizing that when we are implementing this technology in the smart city, it's not simply just this neutral tool of optimal social progress, but does empower certain groups over others and does have biases baked in terms of who's benefiting from that technology and who's going to lose out with that technology.
So what are some of the rules that policymakers should follow here? Are there certain principles that cities should be thinking about when they implement smart cities?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there are a lot of ways that smart city implementations are going wrong, but there are also general processes that cities can be following to go well. So this is something that I've thought about a lot over the last 5 years. I've worked with city governments as a data scientist, both externally as a sort of project partner. Internally within the city, I worked in the city of Boston for a year as a data scientist, working with various departments across the city on this, as well as have worked with a number of other cities sort of thinking about policy and implementation. So in my research on smart cities, I sort of think about different principles that are essential to creating cities that integrate technology without sort of believing that technology itself can provide the answers. And I'll sort of talk about maybe 2 or 3 of these. I think the really important one for me is recognizing the complexity of problems and that technology is not going to provide a perfect solution. Oftentimes, technology is seen as this great utopian solution to a social problem because the perspective of a scientist or engineer tends to make that problem into something that's far simpler than it actually is. And so there's this idea that we can provide these perfect solutions to these simple problems when in fact they're far more complex and technology is only going to be able to, at best, address some small portion of it. Another one that I think about is prioritizing policy and program reforms over innovative technology. All too often, we talk about innovation, and innovation often comes to mean just using new technology. And often it means implementing new technology into outdated and existing processes, which typically tends to just sort of grease the wheels of already flawed systems rather than actually creating systems that address the types of problems that people really have. Oftentimes, the most powerful examples they're not just cases where a city came in and found a cool new app or algorithm and that solved a problem. They are cities where for 5 or 10 or 20 years, they've been working in broad fashion to really think about how to address problems of urban planning and transportation and social justice. And only over time, they've been able to come up with thoughtful program and policy reforms to address those issues. And in recent years, they've found ways that technology can help boost and improve their efforts. But fundamentally, it's the sort of policy and program analysis and implementation that's driving the real benefits, and then the technology that's able to play some role in improving that process.
So it can't be, and as you just suggested, it can't be that all cities are bad, right? They can't all be doing it wrong. What would you say are some examples of cities that are doing the best job at making sure smart cities take actual people, taxpayers, into account?
Yeah, and I think so sort of to the point I was just making about long-term planning and technology, one of the cities that is most inspiring to me is Columbus, Ohio. So a couple years ago, I guess around 2016, Columbus, Ohio won a grant from the Department of Transportation. They put out a Smart City Challenge, and about 75 cities applied. And, it wasn't Austin, Texas, or Boston, or San Francisco that won. It was Columbus, Ohio. And they had this really interesting plan. Rather than sort of being your typical plan of we're going to have self-driving cars that are going to just zoom around the city and pick everyone up and there'll be no traffic because we'll live in this futuristic utopia, Columbus had a much different plan. They had spent the prior 5 or 10 years really rethinking what sorts of urban planning goals they wanted to have. They'd been a community that had been dominated by sprawl for several decades. And they realized that for their community to thrive, they needed to counteract those trends and to really focus on dense mixed-use development. In the meantime, they also had been really focused on addressing infant mortality, which was a pretty severe issue in certain neighborhoods across the city. And they brought their plan for the Smart City Challenge to really address both of these issues. And they came up with a lot of really thoughtful ways that technology could help pregnant and new mothers get access to healthcare, which was often a huge issue. And it was a huge variety of things, not just fancy technologies around self-driving cars, but stuff around creating better apps that integrate information, having better access to Wi-Fi so that residents in these neighborhoods would actually be able to access information about when buses or other ride-sharing options might be available, and even just providing childcare so that the women who already have children can get to a doctor's appointment for a new baby, or can get to a job interview so that they can access, unemployment. And so by integrating these sorts of programs together, they were able to recognize and address the complexities of how real people interact with social challenges that they face. And a lot of this was based on not just sitting around a boardroom thinking about what sorts of fancy technology could solve problems, but actually going out into the communities and talking to people to say, what sorts of problems are you facing? What sorts of remedies would be useful to you? Mm-hmm. And that really transformed the types of solutions that they came up with. I think had they, sort of stayed closeted away in their focus of just the managers and the technologists, they would have come up with something that maybe seemed cooler and flashier on the surface, but actually didn't address the real problems.
Well, thanks for raising these issues, Ben. I think we see this in when cities implement technology generally, when it comes to smart cities, or when it comes to presuming that if different companies locate in an area, that it'll affect the city in some way that they're not really circumspect about. I think that Amazon is a perfect example. I was born in Columbus, grew up in New York, and Amazon is a perfect example. I mean, sure, generally it looks like a great deal, but did they do the legwork going into the communities and finding out how the deal could help them, as opposed to just assuming that it can help them by creating whatever unspecified jobs they said it was going to create? So I'm seeing it, but I'm seeing this trend that a lot of us have been advocating for a while now. That's kind of more responsive, I think, to the needs of communities. And we've also seen this to some extent in this trend towards hiring people with liberal arts degrees. So thanks so much for being here. And to everyone listening, buy the book. It's called The Smart Enough City, MIT Press. It'll be out April 9th, and it's available for pre-order at lots of bookstores.
Yeah, it'll be out on April 9th, both in hardcover form. You can order on MIT Press's site, Amazon, IndieBound, Barnes & Noble, etc. It'll also be available fully open source. And so starting April 9th, there will be a version, I think, via the MIT Press's website to read fully open without having to pay a dime. So really should be accessible to everyone.
You ready for the icebreaker?
Yep.
Okay, let's do that. Get some career insights from you and hear about what you're reading these days. Okay, so it's time for this week's icebreaker. Ready?
Absolutely. Let's do it.
Okay, what's your favorite movie?
Oh, that's a tough question. So finally, just this past weekend, the other night, I finally got around to seeing the new Spider-Man movie, Into the Spider-Verse. And I got to say, I was really into it. I thought it was one of the most thoughtful and just creatively produced movies I'd seen in years. The story, but also the animation and sort of the general style that blended sort of real action with comic book style visual effects was just really quite remarkable to actually see, especially in a superhero movies, which so often can tend to be just sort of explosions and bland characters.
Yeah, I haven't seen Spider-Man yet, but I really like superhero movies because they remind me of a simpler time when it was just comic books. But I went to see Jordan Peele's Us over the weekend. It was groundbreaking, but I have to see it again because it's really cerebral and kind of goes way beyond horror in a lot of ways, I think. So I need to watch it a couple more times so I can connect the dots a bit on that. How do you come up with research ideas, Ben?
So it's a pretty broad process. I mean, I think for me, really, it's trying to identify where there are issues where technology is either able to provide useful solutions or technology is being applied in dangerous ways to provide solutions. So I am most interested in the ways that technology intersects with cities and city government. And so, especially earlier on, a lot of my work was motivated by the desire as someone with a lot of data science skills to help apply those skills and help cities solve problems with data. And increasingly, my work has been really motivated, as sort of the book indicates, by seeing the ways that we've gone too far in that direction, that often we're applying technology in dangerous ways. And I see ways that my own understanding of technology, of city government, and of the implications of technology can help us or help cities or help society or help the public better understand what the risks and dangers and trade-offs are. So for me, it's really trying to identify what the sort of pressing issues are and where I feel like I can lend a voice that will help shape or push the debate in a better direction.
Yeah, I found that reading a lot is kind of what triggers the most relevant questions. And then so it's really time consuming. There's just so much to read, and all these books. I think they haven't done their job if they don't leave you with a sort of a burning question, a place for you to pick up from. And I think that's what your book does, because now I want to develop ways to go into cities and hear what people are looking for. And
that's really the goal. I think we're at a moment right now where the tide of the conversation around technology has turned between scandals at Google and Facebook and Amazon. We've begun to move away from our idea that technologists are the saviors, that they're going to be the leaders of our society, and begun to realize all of the dangers of technology. And that's happening right as the energy for smart cities has been picking up. It's becoming sort of the de facto vision for the future of cities from most city leaders and other sort of powerful political and business folks. And so I think there's a real moment that I'm trying to insert into to change that conversation and tell us to slow down, and that we probably want to chart a very different path than where we've been going and where we seem to be headed if we don't look around and think about what we're doing.
So tell us about what you're reading these days.
I'm always in the midst of a bunch of papers and books that I'm going through. But one book that I have just been rereading, actually, and that I think is really thoughtful and insightful, is a book called When the State Meets the Street by Bernardo Zacca. And it's a really fascinating book that Zacca is a political scientist, and he spent a year or two working in city agencies and really understanding the ways that frontline workers in government interact with residents and citizens in a city, and really pointing out all of the ways in which we tend as a society to want to diminish their agency and to think of them as sort of mere automatons who are just meting out policy. Yeah. But actually, these people play an essential role in how people interact with and understand what the government is. And often it's the discretion and agency of these individuals that shape whether or not a city agency is able to actually provide effective services and make residents of a city feel that they belong there and are valued in that community. And I think there's a lot of interesting connections to the conversations around smart cities, where, how much do we think that policy can just be made by an algorithm or by a robot or some sort of chat bot, and how much do we think how much can we recognize that in many cases we do genuinely need people making decisions, bringing their knowledge and wisdom and abilities to those conversations and to those interactions with people, rather than thinking we can just have algorithmic automated rules and sort of artificial chatbots to interact with people. I think those are really essential conversations for smart cities and for cities generally.
So making tech more subjective. Well, I'm not getting any younger, Ben, so I've got to get a better understanding, get better about goal setting. I don't want to be around 5-10 years from now and say, what did I do with that time? So goal setting and measuring progress. So I'm currently reading Measure What Matters by John Doerr, which has been an interesting read. Well, thanks again, Ben, for joining me. What are some final ideas you'd like to leave with us, and where can we find you online?
Yeah, I think I think one big idea I'd like to throw out there is for folks in any sector, when we're thinking about new technology and trying to use new technology to improve performance or operations or society, I think one really important thing to keep in mind is, what are we taking as fixed and stable, and what are we taking as variable or things that we can change? I think a lot of the time we think about technology and we have a very narrow focus on what is actually able to be changed and what is actually able to be and what is totally fixed and unchangeable. Mm-hmm. And oftentimes, whether it's in smart cities or in businesses or in other aspects of government, when we think about technology, we assume that policy and practice and values are all totally fixed and that all we can change is the technology. And I think that often gets us down a road towards technology that simply makes existing, often flawed systems more flawed or something like that. So for me, I can be found online on Twitter at BenZevGreen or just online at benzevgreen.com. And so there's sort of lots of information there about the book and some of my other work. And I'm always tweeting and trying to throw out some ideas around these topics. So I'm always excited to engage with more folks on that front.
You've been listening to Ben Green, PhD candidate in applied math at Harvard and an affiliate at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard, and an author of the forthcoming, out April 9th, The Smart Enough City, which you can pick up on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, pretty much wherever you shop for books online. Ben, thanks for joining me. And that concludes episode 180 of the podcast. Thanks so much for listening. If you like what we do, we'd love to hear from you. Please take a moment, head over to Apple Podcasts, give it a review. It helps others know what they can expect from the show and really helps us out. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you back here next week. Take care.
Washington Tech.